Here's what most people think they know about PSI and bucket contribution changes, that if you see a shift in how your data is distributed across buckets, especially a big one, it's a red flag. It means something's wrong with your model or your data. That's how most marketers interpret the numbers. But here's the thing they're missing. That signal isn't always about failure. Sometimes it's telling you that the system itself has changed in a way that makes your old model obsolete, and that you might actually be better off retraining on the new data than fighting the shift. Most marketers see PSI go up past 0.1 or 0.2 and panic. They treat any change like a bug, not a feature. It's not that the data is bad, it's that it's different. And sometimes that difference means you're not just adapting to reality, you're actually getting better at it. What they don't realize is that when PSI hits that level, it's often a sign of a model evolution, not a breakdown. This is Marketing Science, the show about data-driven marketing and how to think like a scientist. I'm Mikey, and today we're talking about PSI and bucket contribution changes. Not just what they mean, but what you do with them once you see them. This stuff shows up in every model you build, from propensity scores to risk models, especially when you're tracking spend or behavior over time. Let me explain the core idea. PSI stands for Population Stability Index. It's a measure of how much your data distribution has shifted over time. Like if you have a model that was trained on a certain mix of customers, and now you're seeing new customer groups showing up in a different proportion. That change is measured by comparing the expected distribution to the actual one, using bucketed data. When you see that index go past 0.1 or 0.2, especially when it hits 0.5 or higher, it's telling you that your model's assumptions are no longer valid. That's not a death sentence, that's a call to action. So what do you do with that signal? First, you calculate bucket contributions. You split your data into buckets, then compare how much each bucket contributes to the PSI. Then you look for shifts that go beyond the noise, like when one bucket suddenly jumps from 10% to 30% in a way that causes the total PSI to spike past your threshold. It's not just about what's changed, it's about how much it's changed and whether that shift is meaningful. If you're tracking social spend, for example, and you see a bucket contribution go from 20% to 39% in one period, and the same jump happens in another bucket, your PSI will go up. That's not just an error. That could be a sign of growth, or a new channel, or a realignment in customer behavior. Once you've identified the shifts, it's time to retrain, not just to adjust, to fully rebuild if necessary. You need to look at what the buckets are telling you and how that translates into your model architecture. Here's the full process, step by step. First, bucket your data. You take the variable you're tracking, say customer lifetime value or social spend share, and divide it into consistent bins. If you're tracking spend share, for example, you might have buckets like 0 to 10%, 11% to 20%, 21% to 30%, etc. Then calculate the expected percent for each bucket based on your baseline model data. Next, get the actual percent, the real-world values from your most recent period. Now, for each bucket, you take the difference between expected and actual, square it, divide by expected or actual, and sum all those up to get your PSI. But that's just the start. You also look at bucket contribution. It's the same idea. How much did each bucket affect the overall PSI? If one bucket shifts from 20% to 30% and the rest stays steady, it may be the culprit behind a sudden PSI jump. When you see a big jump in bucket contribution, don't just adjust, retrain. That's where most marketers go wrong. They tweak parameters or make small corrections instead of taking a full model overhaul. If your model is based on old bucket distributions and now they've shifted significantly, that means the training data isn't reflective of the current reality. One thing you'll want to check, if several buckets are shifting at once, especially across the same direction, say social spend shifts from 10% to 25%, then email from 30% to 40%, that's a strong signal. You're not just seeing noise, you're seeing evolution in the way customers behave. The takeaway is simple. If your PSI hits 0.1 or higher, it's time to retrain, not adjust. But more than that, it's a sign you may be better off starting fresh with a rebuild rather than patching an old model. The rule isn't whether the PSI is high, it's whether the changes are meaningful and systemic enough that your model is no longer aligned with the data. Now, here's where things go sideways. First, people ignore bucket contributions entirely and treat PSI like a magic number. They only look at the overall index, not how individual buckets are shifting, which is like judging a car by its speed instead of looking at how the engine is running. That leads to blind adjustments that don't fix anything. Second, they try to patch their model instead of rebuilding it when there's a clear shift in bucket contributions, especially across multiple buckets. You think you're saving time and money by tweaking, but you're just delaying the inevitable. Third, they forget that PSI is not about bad data, it's about good data that has changed. It's a signal that the environment evolved, and you need to adapt your model accordingly. Not every PSI spike means your model is broken, it might mean it's ready for an upgrade. And lastly, they don't realize that a spike in PSI isn't always an immediate problem. It could be a chance to find a better model. If the shift is consistent and you can understand the reason behind it, you're not just fixing a leak, you're building a more accurate flow. To give you a clearer picture of how all this plays out, let's walk through what happens when bucket contributions really start moving. Imagine you're tracking social spend share over time. Your first period shows that 20% of your total spend comes from social platforms, and the rest is split among email, search, and display in roughly equal parts. Then comes a new period, say a few months later, where the social bucket jumps to 30%, while email increases from 25% to 39%. That alone won't push your PSI over the line. But if you've also seen a similar jump in the display bucket, maybe from 25% to 32%, and there's some movement across other categories too, then those combined shifts could easily lift the overall index past that 0.1 or 0.2 threshold. So here's how that plays out. You start with your original distribution, social at 20%, email at 25%, search at 25%, display at 25%. Then you get new data. Now it looks like this. Social jumps to 30%, email increases to 39%, search stays flat, and display moves to 32%. Each of these buckets contributes differently to the PSI, especially when you compute that squared difference divided by expected or actual percent for each one. That's where you see the impact, not just the overall index. That's a real-world scenario, not an abstract idea, and it happens all the time in live models. It tells you something important. Your old model is no longer matching the truth of what's happening out there in the data stream. And here's another detail. Often, when one bucket changes dramatically, it can be the tip of a larger iceberg. Maybe social is growing faster because of new ad platforms, or email is shifting because of a campaign overhaul. Either way, these aren't just quirks, they're signals that your model needs to shift too. So, here's the whole thing, in a nutshell. PSI isn't just about failure, it's about evolution. When bucket contributions change enough to push PSI above 0.1, that's not just noise, it's a signal that your model has outlived its usefulness. That's when you build a new one. That's marketing science. If this one helped you understand how to act on PSI signals, the full process is inside the course at learn.mikey.ai. I'm Mikey. Go look at what's really changing.